Okay, so this is my meeting for lesson 9. So I just start. So number 1 says, I completed the individual preparation assignment before attending the group meeting. That's true. I actively participated in this lessons group meeting. True. And then number 3 says, a hypothesis test consists of 2 hypotheses, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Which one represents the status quo? And I said the null hypothesis because that's part of the definition of the null hypothesis. Then number 4 says which hypothesis involves equality. That's also the null hypothesis because that's the original hypothesis value. It's equal to whatever value is associated with it. And then the next thing says the p-value is the probability of obtaining a sample statistic at least as extreme as the one that was actually observed. Use this information to answer question number 5. So question 5 says, when computing this probability, which hypothesis do you assume to be true? And that is also the null hypothesis, because if the p-value is greater than alpha, you don't reject the hypothesis. So if it was at least as extreme as the one you calculated, the null hypothesis would be true. So that's the reasoning for that. The next one says, suppose the null hypothesis is 10, and use this information to answer questions 6 through 8. So 6 says, which of the following represents the alternative hypothesis for a two-tailed test? So that would be the third answer, which is different than 10 because that represents a two-tailed test because it also represents what's less than or greater than. Then number 7 says, which of the following represents the alternative hypothesis for a left-tailed test? And that's the first answer because if it's less than, that represents the left-tailed test. 8 says, which of the following represents the alternative hypothesis for a right-tailed test? So using the same logic, if it's greater than 10, it would be for a right-tailed test. So that's the second answer. Then it says, the outcome of a hypothesis test is determined by comparing the p-value to the level of significance, or alpha. Use this information for questions 9 and 10. So 9 says, which relationship would result in failing to reject the null hypothesis? And it is the first answer, which is the p-value greater than alpha. And that's because if the p-value is greater than alpha, you don't reject the null hypothesis. And then number 10 is, which relationship would result in rejecting the null hypothesis? And that's the second answer, which is p-value less than alpha. And this is just the opposite of the last question. So if the p-value is less than alpha, you do reject the null hypothesis. Then an insurance company is reviewing its current policy rates. When originally setting the rates, they believed that the average claim amount was $1,500. They are concerned that the true mean is actually higher than this. Use this information for questions 11 and 12. So 11 is, which of the following would be the appropriate alternative hypothesis? So this is the third answer, which is the average claim amount is greater than $1,500. And that is because that's just the opposite of the null hypothesis, which is the alternative. 12 is, which of the following would be appropriate for the null hypothesis? And that's the first answer, which is the average claim amount is equal to $1,500. And that's just because the null hypothesis is equal to what the value is in the question. Then it says the insurance company randomly selects 40 claims and calculates a sample mean of 1,650. Use this information to answer questions 13 through 15. So 13 says the insurance company assumes the distribution of the sample mean is normal. Is this a good assumption? I answered yes. And then 14 says what theorem or law justifies your answer to the previous question? And I said central limit theorem, because the central limit theorem states that if a sample size is large, the shape of the sampling distribution of the sample mean will be. So then 15 says, which of the following is the test statistic as defined in this lesson? And that is Z for Z-score. Then the historical mean of sales receipts at a grocery store is $150 with a standard deviation of $40. The store manager suspects that the average has decreased. She sets up a hypothesis test with the following hypotheses. So 16 says, what is the Z-score associated with this test? And I got negative 0.900 by using the Z-score formula. And 17 is, what is the p-value associated with the Z-score from the previous question? And that is 0.184. And I got 0.184 by using the Z-score in the applet and shading to the left because of how the question's worded. Then 18, what would you make for this problem? And I said that you would fail to reject the null hypothesis. And that's because the alternative hypothesis is actually correct. Then 19 says there are two types of errors that can be made when performing a hypothesis test. Which one involves rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true? And that is type 1, because a type 1 error is when the null hypothesis should be rejected and the null is correct as well. So that's just the definition of a type 1 error. And 20 says, a researcher decided that instead of using a level of significance of alpha 0.05, he will use alpha 0.01. Which of the following will be true? And I put the second answer, which is the probability of a type 2 error will increase. And that's because if the alpha is smaller, it increases the probability of the null hypothesis being true. And a type 2 error is when the alternative hypothesis is true. And then finally, 21 says, if alpha equals 0.05, compute the probability of committing a type 1 error. And I got this answer wrong. I thought that it would be 95%, so I am actually not sure what the answer would be. So that is my lesson 9 group meeting.